winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress, as high as a horse's bridle, for 1,600 stadia. Chapter 15. Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and amazing, 7 angels with 7 plagues, which are the last, for with them the wrath of God is finished. And I saw what appeared to be a sea of glass mingled with fire, and also those who had conquered the beast and its image and the number of its name, standing beside the sea of glass with harps of God in their hands. And they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and amazing are your deeds, O Lord God Almighty. Just and true are your ways, O King of the nations. Who will not fear, O Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. After this I looked, and the sanctuary of the tent of witness in heaven was opened, and out of the sanctuary came the 7 angels with the 7 plagues, clothed in pure bright linen with golden sashes around their chests. And one of these 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God who lives forever and ever. And the sanctuary was filled with the smoke of the glory of God and from his power. And no one could enter the sanctuary until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were finished. All right, so you remember where we left off last time. We have seen the forces of the dragon marshaling themselves to war against the saints. First, the dragon himself appears, right? The dragon comes thrown down from heaven by Michael and his angels, and then the dragon stands on the shore of the sea, and he calls out of the shore a monster, a beast from the sea. And then the beast from the sea and the dragon together, they call up a beast from the land, right? This thing that's a false prophet. It looks like a lamb, but it has a voice like the dragon. And together these 3 marshal their forces to call everyone to worship the beast and the dragon. They call the forces of the nations together to send them against the saints. And yet we saw in the beginning of chapter 14, the saints ultimately untouched here. We saw at least this army of the 144,000 who refuse the mark of the beast, who stand on Mount Zion with the Lamb, singing the song of the Lamb, unbesmirched by the evils of the world, no lie in their mouths, standing kind of forever untouched and beyond the reach of the beast and the dragon, right? And we're given this warning that whereas the mark of the beast has given the power of commerce, right? It lets the people buy and sell and to do things in this world. We are told then that there will be no rest for those who have the mark of the beast, whereas for those who have the mark of the Lamb on their forehead, they will enter into rest, right? There will be rest for them. That's about the point where we left off. The last words we looked at in chapter 14 then were this promise, Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed are those who die. And there's this idea, if we begin where we started here in chapter 14, there's this idea of those who have, let me skip forward just a little bit, of those who have conquered the beast and its image and the number of its name here in chapter 15, just as we begin, right? And I think these ideas are linked. Those who die in the Lord from now on and those who conquer the beast and its image seem to be sort of the same group, right? It is this recurring theme that it is those who die and remain faithful are the victorious ones, those who overcome, as we see even back at the very beginning of the book. Ever and again, that's the victory that's associated with the saints of the Lamb. Not that they've defeated the beast in battle, but that they have not been overcome by him. We come now to a figure, and look, this is a chapter where there's a little bit less controversy than some of the other ones we've looked at, but let's grab one point of debate right out of the beginning. We've got this figure sitting on a cloud that's described as one like a son of man. Now that language ought to cue us to thinking to who this might be, right? Who is the one like a son of man? It's Christ, right? Almost always that language is Christ. In the Gospels, that's one of his favorite ways of describing himself. Ultimately, this language is borrowed from Daniel chapter 7, right? Daniel says, I saw in the night visions, And behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away. It seems almost to beggar the imagination to say that John gives us now a figure standing on a cloud, described like a son of man, and doesn't want us to have that vision in mind, right? Clearly that's the referent. And yet something odd happens here. What's the odd thing that happens to the Son of Man? He gets an instruction, right? There's this odd moment here where an angel comes out and turns to what sure seems to be Christ and says, go reap, right? Go put your sickle in now. And so some have looked at this and said, maybe that's, for all the language aside, maybe that is an angel here that's being described. It seems weird that Christ should be receiving direction from an angel. Most commentators look at this and say, no, that's unmistakably that's Christ. It's too much the Daniel 7 language. It can't be anyone else. What we are seeing here is a declaration and not a position of authority, right? It is not that the angel is in charge of what happens here. It is that he is making declaration of what now needs to be done, and Christ, of course, is carrying out what needs to be done, right? We see here Christ in one of his maybe less comforting visages here. What's in his hand? The sickle, right? Now the image of, we think about the picture of the Grim Reaper with his sickle, right? That image is not going to become commonplace until about the Middle Ages. That's the point where we really see that as a visual motif start to show up. But you can see maybe a pre-echo of that showing up here. This idea of that Christ stands here ready to thresh, right? Ready to reap in all of the grain that's being harvested here. We see, in fact, two separate harvests, one of grain and one of grapes, described back to back, right? The same language appears here twice in a row. First, Christ, the one like the Son of Man, is told to put in his sickle and gather the grain. Then we're told that another angel is given a command to put his sickle in and gather up the grapes to the winepress. And there's some question, again, as to whether this is describing one event in two ways or two different events here. Like, why do we see this one image repeated immediately back to back? What's the point of the two different metaphors here? Is this one thing being described in two ways, or is it two different harvests that are being described? You see what I'm saying? Some have pointed to this and they've said, I think this is two different harvests being described. There's a couple arguments for that. One of those is, you notice in this passage that both the wheat harvest and the grape harvest are described as ripe, right? The harvest is ripe, the harvest is ready. If you go back into the Greek on this, it's two different words for ripe. It's not the same description of how the harvest is ready. And so some have pointed to that and they've said, look, this is two different kinds of readiness. It's two different kinds of being ready. This is, some have argued, a reference back to Matthew chapter 13, right? You remember the parable of the wheat and the tares. There's a farmer, he's got a field full of wheat. He wakes up in the morning and discovers that some enemy has sown false wheat in among the rest, these weeds that are growing up that are indistinguishable while they're young. And it won't be until the wheat is ready to harvest that you can tell which one is which. And the angels say, well, should we go out and pull up all the weeds? And he says, no, wait until both have grown up, and then we will pull out the tares and burn them, and we'll harvest the wheat and gather it into barns. And so some have looked at this passage and have said, this is the fulfillment of Matthew 23. This is the gathering of the wheat into barns. That's what's being described here, in which case the wheat would be what? It would be us, right? It would be the believers. If you hold to a late rapture, right? So a mid-trib or post-trib rapture, where very late in the process, Christians are taken out of the world, right? If that's the position that you would see here, this is probably your last clear moment for that. Does that make sense? right? This is the church is gathered into barns just before this final set of 7 judgments takes place. These final bowl judgments are going to be poured out on the world. I think that's a difficult reading here. Now, there's one final argument for it, and that's the wheat. Nothing bad happens to the wheat, right? Something bad happens to the grapes. What happens to the grapes?
Press of God's wrath.
They get put into the winepress of God's wrath. That's a pretty unambiguous, you don't want to be there descriptor, right? The grapes clearly are bad. The wheat, maybe not, right? So that's an argument some have made. I think this is a difficult case to make. Here's why. First off, like I said, there are different words being used for how ripe the wheat is versus how ripe the grapes are. But neither of the words is particularly good. The ripeness of the wheat has an idea that goes with it of it's dried up. Almost it's too late to be harvesting this in. We have let it go as far as we possibly can. That doesn't sound like the kind of description you want to hear offered to the church, right? They're all dried up. It's time to gather them in here. It doesn't to me really seem to fit with the descriptor of Matthew 23, because in Matthew 23, still there's this earlier harvest where you've got to get the tares out of the way first, right? We don't see anything like that showing up here in Revelation chapter 14. And there's no indication of anything bad happening to the wheat, but there's also no indication of anything good happening to it, right? It gets cut down with a sickle. If that was the only information you had, you'd probably say that seems maybe not like an ideal chain of events to happen, right? That doesn't seem necessarily like where you want to be. And so I think it's difficult to make the argument that these are separate events. It seems to me that this is 2 ways of emphasizing the world has been given as long as it possibly can be given to repent, to do something. And finally the time has come to say, there will be no more delay. Now the harvest is going to be collected. The harvest that has been let to ripen as long as it possibly can. Does that make sense? Anybody questions, pushback, anything there? All right, very good. So, we have a harvest that is ripe, indeed that is overripe. One of the emphases in chapters 14 and 15 and on into 16 is the justice of God in carrying out what he's about to do. The descriptions of the judgments are so terrible that the narrative pauses repeatedly to say God is just and right in what he is doing here, right? There's an emphasis and a repetition of the idea that he has been patient, that there has been opportunity to repent, and those opportunities have been squandered, and that even as the judgments head into this last terrible phase, still those opportunities are going to be squandered. Still there will be a rejection of every chance to turn. And so there's this emphasis on we are late season. The grapes have hung on the vine until they are past the ideal point. It is long time to harvest them, and what is long overdue now needs to be brought to its final consummation here. What is that consummation? It is a throwing, as we say, into the winepress of the wrath of God. Now, this is a language that's got rich references back to various points in the Old Testament. For instance, I think one of the clear references here, so we've got this metaphor of that they will be thrown into the winepress and they will be trodden in the press until blood runs out of this winepress, right? As the grapes are crushed, it's not wine that comes out, it's blood that flows out of the press, blood up to the bridles of the horses, right? So if you can picture maybe some 3-4 feet off the ground that the blood has flowed here, that's the image here. If anybody's seen the old Stanley Kubrick The Shining movie, right? Maybe you'll picture the scene that I kind of visualize here, that it's just this tidal wave of death flowing out from the winepress of wrath, right? One of the clearest references here goes all the way back to the book of Genesis, and it's one of Jacob's blessings upon his children, right? You remember he goes through this list of blessings that's given to each of his descendants. One of these is to Judah, right? Judah, of course, being the kingly tribe of Israel, the tribe from which Christ is descended. And we're told the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Binding his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. And of course, that idea of the foal, the colt of the donkey, has messianic connotations to us, right? We see in that the triumphal entry in Christ. He has washed his garments in wine and his vesture in the blood of grapes. And so now we see in chapter 14, we see a promise made just a few verses before where we are that now we find the fulfillment of, right? We've read in chapter 14 about Babylon. We haven't seen much of who Babylon is yet, but we've seen that there's this evil world power Babylon, and we're told that Babylon has caused the nations to become drunk on wine so that they participate in her sexual immoralities, right? That she has drunken all of them with her wine. And then this angel turns and gives a warning and says, and if anyone takes part in this, if anyone participates, if anyone worships the beast in its image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of his anger, and he'll be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels. There's an idea here, I'm told, in some of the language, that the wine has been spiced with the wrath of God. It's not just strong, undiluted wine. It's wine that's been mixed with the herbs of wrath, which is not a phrase we get to say very often, right? That it is stronger, it is spiced, it burns going down, right? That's kind of the image being called up here. Now we see the wine of God's wrath. It comes out of the winepress of God's wrath. That feels like it makes sense, right? Now we see the fulfillment of that promise. Again, we can see this language. I said this has lots of Old Testament allusion. It draws also, I think, out of the book of Joel. So here we have in Joel's prophecies, we've seen Joel come into play elsewhere in Revelation. We now see it again. Hasten and come, says Joel, all you surrounding nations, and gather yourself there. Bring down your warriors, O Lord. Let the nations stir themselves up and come to the valley of Jehoshaphat. For there I will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. Watch this. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Go in, tread, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their evil is great. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. For the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. The sun and the moon are darkened, and the stars withdraw their shining. So this cosmic language that we've already seen echoed in Revelation, right? Previously in the trumpet judgments, we've seen a third of the sun, moon, and stars have been struck so that they no longer give light. We're going to see a further curse on the heavens in the verses yet to come. And so I think there's lots of connection here to this passage that again borrows the metaphor of the treading of the winepress. If Michael Card hadn't had a great song to reference for this morning's lesson, I think the other song my mind goes to immediately when I read these verses is the battle hymn of the Republic, right? Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is what? Trampling out the vineyards where the grapes of wrath are stored, right? This is the passage that sits behind that song. That's the metaphor in play here. God comes trampling in his wrath. The vats overflow, we're told in the consequence. In this case, overflow up to the bridles. Out to 1,600 stadia. So, we'll all just do stadia to miles conversions in our head here, right? What is 1,600 stadia? It's about 200 miles, right? So the picture here is something like, the language is a little bit confused. The language is a little bit hard to follow, but the picture is something like a circle 200 miles, either 200 miles across, end to end, or 200 miles in radius, right? Drawn around this central point. Why 200 miles? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's get some, that should be easy. What are some things that are about 1,600 stadia across? Well, the land of Israel is about 200 miles north to south, end to end. If you stretch the thing out, it is about 1,600 stadia across. So this could be a way of saying the whole land of Israel becomes a bloodbath, becomes filled with blood. Picture, if you will, if you want to take the preterist or the post-millennial reading here, right? This works really nicely. Rome has come into Israel, right, in judgment, in destruction on the Jewish people, and the whole land from top to bottom across 1,600 stadia of Israel now is filled with blood as the Romans massacre their way across the country. On the other hand, this is also the width of Italy from side to side. So the narrow way and not the long way, right? You measure across Italy, it is also about 1,600 stadia. So this could be a prophecy of judgment on Rome, right? A promise that Rome will be filled with blood in payment for the evils. If you see Babylon as being associated with Rome, right? If you see the beast with its heads and horns as a reference to the 7 hills of Rome, which is what the passage tells us, that the beast sits on 7 hills. If you see that connection, well, then this is Rome being judged, perhaps, and that's 200 miles of Rome that's now being judged. We always like to just check in with the historic view that says this is the papacy, right? The historic view that was very popular in the early days of the Reformation said there is going to be a great judgment on Italy. This is going to be a punishment of the papacy and of papal power where Rome will bleed in this way. Others, if you are more of an amillennial bent, right? So amillennialism is going to focus on the symbology of these descriptions. It's going to say this is not a literal place and a literal radius. Instead, numbers are meant to evoke things to us, right? Numbers are meant to call to mind the significance of those numbers and to emphasize their point to us. What is 1,600? It's 40 times 40. What does 40 usually show up as? What does 40 usually mean when it shows up in Scripture? It's a long time. Do you want to have 40 of something? Do people who get 40 of something in the Bible usually appreciate the 40 that they've got? What are some things you get 40 of? Okay, 40 lashes, right? What else? Okay, in the flood, 40 days and nights of rain, right? What else? 40 years in the Israel, right? Of wandering in the desert from Israel, right? Usually when 40 shows up, 40 is a judgment, right? 40 is a thing that happens to you that is a time of suffering or of trial or sometimes of proving. So fasting 40 days in the wilderness could be, not a time of judgment on Christ, but a time of proving, of trial, right? And so 40 here, 40 squared is all the judgment. Judgment times judgment, right? Trial times trial is the punishment here. Or it could be 4 times 10 times 10, right? 10 being a complete number, a finished number. 4, again, emphasizing, a fullness or a completion here. Maybe that's we don't know, right? But depending whether you want to see this as more symbolic in character or more literal in character, those are going to be the primary readings of this number. Some have, one final one here, some have also argued that this is the distance that the Roman army marches as it goes to Jerusalem. If you track out their path, this is not a circle, it is a line, and the line is 1,600 stadia long. You can picture the army leaving blood and destruction in its wake. It is difficult, even for the most dyed-in-the-wool, hardcore, read everything in Revelation literally folks. It is difficult to read this passage fully literally. I did a little bit of math on my way to preparing for today, and if you actually want to draw a circle 200 miles in radius and fill it, let's say, 3 feet up with blood, like not to be gruesome on a Sunday morning, but that's what the passage says, right? Take it up with God. You need several 100 billion people to contribute to that, right? Now, in some future world, could that maybe theoretically be possible of the human race someday? Maybe it could, right? I mean, A lot more people today than there were when John wrote this. But the math is difficult, yeah? And so something here seems to be more evocative than strictly, strikingly literal here, right? That there's this image of the tidal wave of blood flowing out. Something in here seems like it might have a more symbolic character. Does that make sense? Anybody there? Quiet bunch today, okay? Okay, we exit chapter 14 on that cheerful note, and we come into chapter 15. Chapter 15 begins then our last cycle of judgments, the bowl judgments. With them we are told these are the last, for with them the wrath of God is finished. That is going to be a good indication as to their character. By the time the bowls are done, there will be nothing left, right? There will be no judgment left to pour out. There will be very close to nothing left to judge. Remember, if you will, that there are three major views of the timeline of Revelation. One view sees the book as primarily chronological. There's exceptions to that, right? Not perfectly chronological, but mostly mostly the seals, then the trumpets, then the bowls. And in that reading, okay, well, that declaration makes sense, right? These are the last judgments. Why are these the last judgments? Because we're reading time forward. Here we are, right? We're at this point. After them, we're done. Yeah? Another view sees these as nestings and says the seventh of the seals incorporates the rest of the book. The seventh seal, in its description, some of the things described as part of the seventh seal will also show up in the seventh trumpet and the seventh bowl, because the seventh seal includes everything left to happen. It's all the seventh seal. Likewise, the seventh trumpet, in its description of what's going to happen, it incorporates everything that's going to happen in all of the bowls. And so all these bowls kind of collapse in on that. And so if you look at the last trumpet and the last bowl and the last seal, you'll see they all include things about earthquakes and hail and fire and lightning, and that there's similar descriptions that come across all these. And so this reading would say all of those are describing a final moment of Christ's return. The last judgment in each sequence is simultaneous. Does that make sense? A third perspective sees this as a recapitulation, that each of these series fully describes the same event. So if you have some period, maybe it's 7 years, maybe it's some different period of time, whatever it is, you've got this period of time, and the seals describe how things flow across that period of time. There's war, there's famine, there's disease, there's an earthquake, right? These things play out, and then the trumpets back up, rewind the clock, and play that same chain of events forward again with a different emphasis, a different focus. And then the trumpets finish, and they rewind the clock, and they play that same chain of events out again with the bowls emphasizing totality a little bit more. Of course, beyond these three, there's a fully symbolic view that says these are all just describing the kinds of ways that God judges wickedness. There's not meant to be a timeline here at all. These are just evocative of the ways God judges the wicked, and not this happens, that happens, that happens, that happens. But if you want some kind of timeline, those are the three basic views. With me so far? Now, I'll admit that before starting this series, I had never had a lot of time for the recapitulation view. It had always seemed pretty weak to me. But looking at the parallels between the trumpets and the bowls, there are some striking similarities. So let me just go a slide forward here. I've laid out here for you all of the seal, trumpet, and bowl judgments. And you can see there's a lot of crossover between them, right? So if I look at these, I notice, for instance, that both the trumpets and the bowls have a curse of darkness that's laid out. Both of them have a curse where water is turned to blood. Both of them have a curse, this is interesting, and we'll look at it more next week. The sixth trumpet and the sixth bowl both have something to do with the river Euphrates being moved or released. And when the river is released, there's an army of horsemen from the east that approaches, right? That description, or elements of that description, show up sixth in both sets of judgments. And of course, seventh in both of these judgments, we find an earthquake, right? And the description of the earthquake, again, is very similar across these two. And so there is, I highlight this a little bit more, there is, especially between the trumpets and the bowls, to a lesser degree between the seals and the rest, right? The seals likewise have promise of conquest and war. They have a significant earthquake very late in the sequence. But there is some significant overlap between these to see this as the same events described here. Now, with all that said, I think there are issues with the recapitulation view as well. Does anybody see a problem with reading this as, or can anybody foresee a problem in reading this as the same set of events described over again?
Well, it just said last, what we just read.
It did, didn't it? It just said these are the last judgments. It seems weird to say, here's the same thing you saw over again, but this is the last one, right? And in fact, we can't even say it's the last one because he's going to end the book after this. The bowl judgments are done by the end of chapter 16. Right? We got 6 more chapters of book after the bowl judgments are done. Most versions of the recapitulation theory say that we hit the end of the bowls and we're going to rewind again and play the whole thing out at least once or twice more. And so in what sense then are they the last? Most of the folks I've read who argue for recapitulation just say they are the last because it's the last chain of judgments that John's going to describe here, right? He described this chain and that chain and that chain. This is the last one he's going to describe, so these are the last judgments of God. That feels a little unsatisfying to me, right? There's also a clear change in severity as we move across judgments. The first set of judgments, for instance, the seals, emphasize the number 4, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the 4 beasts. 1/4 of the world population is struck in the course of those judgments. The seals emphasize 3s, 1/3 of the water, 1/3 of the sea, 1/3 of the ships, 1/3 of the stars, 1/3 of the sun. All these things are struck down, and with them, 1/3 of the population is killed. When we come to the bowls emphasize totality. When the sea is struck, it's not going to be a piece of the sea that goes down. We are going to be told that everything that lives in the sea will die, right? When there is darkness, it is not a piece of the sun. We're just told it's dark, right? The world goes dark. The kingdom of the beast is flung into darkness. And so there's an emphasis on totality that those previous judgments lack. Now you can say, and this is what a recapitulation view will say, a recapitulation view will say, these are the same events, we're just emphasizing more and more how terrible those events are, right? Every telling, we make the language a little stronger to say, no, you didn't get it last time. It's not just going to be bad, it's going to be the greatest, the worst thing that you can imagine, right? But I think it's difficult. I think that's a challenge to that view. Likewise, I think the similarities are a challenge to the other perspectives, right? I think there's difficulties either way you go with that. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so we have a setup here, a promise of a last set of judgments. And we see a sea of glass. Now, you know, when I think about descriptions of heaven, you know, to walk upon the streets of gold beside the crystal sea, it seems peaceful, right? It's a sea like crystal, it's smooth as glass. This sea is currently not in a peaceful state, right? It is a sea of crystal mixed with fire. And there's those standing beside the sea who have conquered the beast and its image here, right? And we're told, well, this is not the first time we've seen the sea of crystal. We have seen it all the way back in chapter 4, right? Chapter 4 gives us this description of the throne room of God. It's the point where John is caught up to heaven for the rest of the vision. And he sees around the throne of God, before the throne there were burning 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God, or the 7-fold Spirit of God. And before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass like crystal. So this seems to be the same image, right? If we're seeing the sea of glass once again, we are presumably once more in the throne room of God. That should contextualize how we read that we see those who have conquered the beast in its image, yeah? If we are in the throne room of God before the sea of glass and we see those who've conquered the beast, what does that tell us about those who've conquered the beast? They're with God, right? The natural reading here, I think the easiest reading is that these are those, they've conquered the beast, they've confronted the beast, right? They've not been lifted out before the beast. I think the most natural reading is these are those who've died, right? Now, maybe there's more to it than that. Maybe that's the church across all ages. Maybe there's a raptured church as part of this. But a natural implication here, I think, is that this continues that theme of we conquer the beast by being faithful even unto death, right? These are those that we see before the sea of glass. And always, always, always in Revelation, at the center of narrative, it is the justice, the character of God that we find re-echoed. They sing here a song, and we're told that this is the song of Moses and of the Lamb. I want you to see one of the other themes of Revelation that we've bumped into from time to time, and that is its efforts to unify the old and the new covenants, right? It is not just the song of the old covenant, right? Who symbolizes the old covenant better than Moses, right? The lawgiver, right? The one who led Israel into the promised land, or at least to the promised land. Who symbolizes the old covenant more than Moses does? This is the song of Moses, and yet it is also the song of the Lamb. The two are one that they sing together. Just and true are your ways, King of Ages, across both covenants, across the Jews and the Gentiles together, all the redeemed people of God in one chorus here. This is an idea we've seen repeatedly, all the way back, I think, to chapter 4, where we see 24 elders around the throne. Why 24 elders? Well, we said then one of the leading theories is 12 tribes of Israel, 12 apostles, right? These are symbolic or in some way representative of those two groups. That again, it is the old, the original chosen people of God and the new fully chosen people of God, the new fulfillment of that into a wider choosing. Both of those stand unified around the throne of God. I think that same idea is in view here. Likewise, the 144,000 of Israel and the numberless multitude who worship the Lamb, however you read those two groups, there's clearly a call back to Israel and the church together here. All right, so we stand beside the sea. We see those worshiping the Lamb here. And one of the four living creatures gave to the seven angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God. And there's smoke goes up from this. Smoke goes up into the sanctuary from the glory of God, and no one can enter the sanctuary. Again, there's an Old Testament callback here. We've just been told this is the song of Moses. Well, what happens with Moses? Moses builds the tabernacle, and we are told that the cloud, right, this cloud that goes before the people of Israel everywhere they go, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, and Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it and the glory of the Lord had filled it. Right? I think that's the image we have here, is that once more, if you read, I believe it's in Ezekiel, we're told that the glory of God departs from the temple, right? There's this vision Ezekiel has of God's glory vanishing from it and abandoning the people. Here we have the temple once more full of the glory of God so that no one can go into it. Okay. We're not going to actually do the bowls today. That's next week. There's enough to say about the bowls. This is our moment of preparation. The temple is, in some sense, sealed. God is full in his glory there so that no one can approach it until the last of his wrath has been poured out on the world. How then do we interpret what's going on here? Well, as is often the case, I think the easiest reading is maybe the amillennial one. Easiest to come to an interpretation here, because the amillennial reading, again, is going to say, don't look for literal, exact one-to-one fulfillment on this. Look for the character, the themes, the numbers. Look for the emphases of the passage, and read that as the story of God's dealing with his people through time, right? What should we expect? The amillennial reading says you should expect that across time the spirit of Antichrist torments the church, right? The world system that ultimately belongs to its father, the devil, right? The nations of the world, the governments of the world, the natural tendency of the world is always going to be towards the prince of the power of the air. It's always ultimately going to be bent towards torment of the people of the Lamb, and yet the people of the Lamb conquer by resisting that even unto death. In the end, the Lamb stands triumphant, the purpose of the Lord stands, and the judgment of the Lord is poured out on wicked nations. And an amillennial reading is going to look back to Daniel, for instance, and say, look at the history of the nations that Daniel describes. Babylon raises itself up. Look at Babylon the Great that I have created. Babylon is laid low. Persia raises itself up. Persia is laid low. Rome raises itself. Nazi Germany raises itself up, right? Each successive wicked nation raises its head toward heaven. Each is struck low in its time, and it says that is the pattern that will continue until at last the Lamb sets up an everlasting dominion. Dennis?
What is amillennial's general view then of Israel in the end? I'm thinking it'll help kind of clarify.
Yeah.
Usually you're looking at this across all time. How do most people in the amillennial camp, and is there a certain denomination or two that really holds to that?
Yeah, great question. So the question was, how would amillennialism see Israel, right? What would their reading of Israel be if this is going to be their interpretation of Revelation as a whole? And obviously there's going to be a diversity of perspectives here, right? You asked, is there a denomination or two that holds to amillennialism in particular? And I think it's worth reminding ourselves that amillennialism is the dominant reading of Revelation among most, let's say, Protestant Christians for the past several hundred years, right? This is the dominant perspective in recent history. There are exceptions to that, right? You get kind of millennial fevers where a premillennial view becomes much more prominent, but it's easy to lose track of that. So if I think Presbyterians, for instance, are going to be mostly more amillennial in their character. I think the same would be true of something like a Methodist church. I think those are often going to be more kind of faithful Methodist church. I think is going to be more amillennial in its character. Most denominations that don't have Baptist in the name somewhere, or maybe Pentecostal in the name somewhere, are going to trend more towards an amillennial reading here. That's not universal, but it's a general guideline, right? What do they do with Israel? So I think, again, there's a diversity of perspectives, but I think most amillennial interpreters would make a clear distinction between national Israel and the Jews as a people, right? And they would say national Israel, by and large, they would say national Israel has no clear role relevant to us today. It might be, it might be a good pragmatic political ally for us, right? There might be practical benefits to having a nation, many of whose people at least are going to accept the old covenant, right? Not salvifically, but still that there's a grace that comes from following tenets of the old covenant, even if they no longer saved, that's going to set you onto a better path than not having that, right? There's some non-salvific grace coming of that, and so there might be pragmatic reasons to support Israel, but that there is not a particular end times fulfillment coming in which Israel as a nation has any particular role, right? Likewise, I think most amillennials would emphasize that the role of the Jews today is the role of everybody else who needs Christ, right? That there's not a particular end times fulfillment that the Jews have. Maybe they would say, some of them would point to Paul and would say, there's going to be, we believe there will be more conversion of the Jews before everything wraps up, that Paul certainly seems to anticipate a great incoming of Israel, but they would not see that as, they would not take the 144,000 as being a specifically Jewish group, for instance. Most amillennials would say that is another way of describing all those who follow the Lamb. It emphasizes that 12 by 12 Old Covenant, New Covenant fulfillment. This is all those following the Lamb. They all sing a new song that only they may sing. They all have his name on their foreheads.
So do they kind of believe in replacement theology then? In a sense?
Yeah, so the question is, would they believe in a replacement theology? So the idea here is that the promises of Israel are ultimately fulfilled in the church, right? Most amillennials, I think, would say yes, that the promises given to Israel expand outward to include all the people of God, and not just a national fulfillment or an ethnic fulfillment there. You can find that in a lot of the Protestant reformers. You can find that, again, I think that's the majority view within Protestantism going forward from the Reformation onward up through today.
Thank you, that helps explain.
Okay, yeah, good. Good questions. Thanks, Dennis. Anybody else here?
I have a question on the end of chapter 14. And I'm just kind of confused as how to look at this.
Yeah.
So if you read that literally, and there is billions of people killed to produce that amount of blood.
Hundreds of billions was my calculation, yeah.
So is this not literal, and is it more a picture of maybe the Battle of Armageddon, or is Armageddon another battle yet to come, and this cannot be literal because there would be nobody?
Yeah, good. Okay, so the question is, who is this? First off, is someone literally dying in the events of the harvesting at the end of chapter 14, right? Is there someone, not in a literal wine press, we should hope, but someone literally being killed such that actual physical blood is flowing in the way being described here? And if so, given the numbers of people required, how is there anybody left after that? Is this Armageddon? Is this some separate event? What is this? So this is something we'll come back to next week because Armageddon is in the midst of chapter 16. And so we'll look a little bit at how the description of Armageddon echoes at that point. But let me give you the preview on that, right? There are about 4 or 5 different places over the course of Revelation where it is described that some great army is riding out in conquest. We get one of those all the way back in chapter 5-ish with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, right? The first of those horsemen, the white horseman, is, we often say, is conquest, right? He goes out, he's given a bow and told to conquer. The red horseman who follows him is war, right? And so there's some sense of war and conquest there. The 6th trumpet judgment, we're told that the 4 angels at the mouth of the river Euphrates are unbound. And then he says, and I heard the number of the horsemen. The number was, and it's this 100 million or 200 million horsemen, myriads upon myriads of horsemen that just are described as being part of that. We're going to see next week in what's actually referred to as Armageddon, right? That's the only place in the book where that word is going to clearly appear. We will be told again the river Euphrates is diverted and the dragon and the beasts gather together the armies of the world to do battle against the Lamb at Armageddon, right? Now that sounds a lot like the same event being described in 2 different places, right? It's both the river Euphrates, it's both this giant army coming up. There's then going to be another description at the end of the millennium, right? So there's this 1,000-year reign of Christ. At the end of that, we are told the nations came, Gog and Magog, to make war against the Lamb, right? Over and again, there's this idea. Now, is that one event? Okay, so an amillennial says, no, that's all human history played out. The story of human history is the armies of the world make war upon the Lamb, and the Lamb is victorious, right? Every evil nation does this. Every evil nation ultimately is ground into the dust, and yet the song of the Lamb goes on, right? Postmillennialism is going to say all that's the fall of Jerusalem, right? All of that is recapitulations of the idea of the war on Jerusalem being echoed over and over again here. Premillennialism is going to answer it different ways, right? Is going to say some of these, at least, are one singular battle, the Battle of Armageddon. Some of it may be other conquests, other wars that are taking place, right? The 100 million horsemen, or 200 million, whichever the number is, I'm blanking in this moment. The horsemen who we're told come from the river Euphrates, those are the guys that we're told go out and kill a third of the world, right? Seems like there's a straightforward connection between they kill a third of the world and the blood flows up to the bridles of the horses. But in this case, we're also being clearly told that this is a judgment of the wrath of God that the blood flows up this high, right? I feel like I'm not answering the question so much as I am tap dancing around it. But you see the complication on that, right? Nothing clearly tells us which of these events are exactly connected to each other. We have to just try to infer and say, is this the same thing getting multiple descriptions, or are these chains of events, or just, again, the kind of thing that happens, right? What seems, and then there's confusion around, again, how big is this area that's being described, right? Is it a path? Is it a circle? Some have tried to argue that when it says the blood flowed up to the bridles, it means, and I apologize for being a little graphic this morning, but it means something like the blood splattered as high as the bridles, right? That there was a spray from the winepress of God's wrath. That feels like kind of an unnatural reading to try to make the numbers seem sensible, right? I don't have a good answer for you, man. That's ways people have tried to deal with this passage, right? It seems hard to read it as not at least a little bit symbolic in character, given the numbers that are involved here. Others, I think, have argued that it's like there will be blood in deep pools in these places, that there will be this massacre on the fields outside Jerusalem that will be deep in this way, but not everywhere, not universally. I don't know, right? Those would be ways we try to make these passages fit together. Is that some answer?
Apparently I'm not the only one.
You're not the only one who's confused. There we go. That's the comfort. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess, I don't think I'm terrible here, but I think the problem I have a lot of times when we interpret is Jesus was the new covenant.
Mm-hmm.
So the new covenant should be all we need. So why is there an interpretation for the Jewish people to come back? That wouldn't it just all be that everybody is everybody?
Okay, so the question is, why would we take a view that has a separation of Jews within the new covenant, given, for instance, Paul's repeated emphasis that there's no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, right? Okay, so we haven't made a distinction between premillennialism and dispensationalism in a while. Let's make that distinction, because dispensationalism is the branch of premillennialism that's going to most clearly say there is a special role for the Jews remaining within the new covenant. And that argument takes several forms. One line of argument comes from, for instance, Paul late in Romans, and it's around chapter 12. It's probably not in chapter 12, but it's there-ish. 11. Thank you, Dennis. In chapter 11, Paul has this long discussion about the relationship between the Jews and the new covenant. Right? He says, "Has God abandoned His people, the Jews? Are all His promises to them void?" Right? Like, what happens now? What's their place in all this? And he says, no, listen, God has brought you Gentiles in order to make the Jews jealous, right? They are the olive tree. Theirs is the story of salvation that you have been grafted into. You're a wild olive branch. You're not supposed to be here. God has brought you into this tree, this story of salvation, and has cut off the natural branches, the Jews, to make space for you. But they're supposed to be there, and you're not. God will graft them in again, says Paul, and so in the end, all Israel will be saved. He will use you to make them jealous and will bring them back in, right? And so some have pointed to that and have said there must still then be some role of great repentance within the Jewish people, within the people of Israel, to come back to come back to Christ, to come back to the new covenant. Obviously not to find salvation as part of the old covenant, but to find it in fulfillment in the new. That's one. Others have argued that there are specific promises made in the Old Testament that require a national fulfillment, right? That there are specific promises about filling the land, right? About just things that will happen to the people of Israel that can only be satisfied in the context of that people in a national arrangement, right? That they need a nation, they need the nation to be where it is today, they need to be that people as a people, that you can't extend the promise to be everybody without it losing its sense altogether, okay? I think those are the two main thrusts that would be pointed to. And then the third would just be that John does highlight, for instance, when he describes the 144,000, he goes out of his way to say 12,000 from this tribe and 12,000 from that tribe and 12,000 from that tribe, and then describes a group that's all tribes and tongues and nations and people. And so an argument that says, look, if he's going to say, here's a group, they're Israelites, here's a group, they're everybody, then there's some special role still being called out. Again, not in any way separate from salvation through Christ. Does that make sense? Now, I'm not telling you I hold all of those, right? I think so for instance, we see unambiguously some of the specific promises to Israel are applied to the church subsequently. Whether all the promises to Israel are applied to the church, that's one of the points of contention, right? That's a point of debate. But that would be, I think, the kind of line of argument that would be made. Is that answering? And that is past the time that I have with you. I'm sorry, I got to let you go. Thank you for your time this morning. I will see you next week when things get real bad. See you then.